during their cousin's stay in Hydesville that the Fox family first heard the strange sounds. Creaking eaves and running mice were all sounds they would have been familiar with, but the sounds they began to hear at night were something different, something strange that they couldn't quite place. A series of thumps in the room where the family would lay down to sleep, almost as if someone was walking around. Then the sounds moved into the wall. It was as if someone was standing beside the beds where they slept, knocking on the bed frame with an invisible hand. At one point, while trying to figure out where the sounds were coming from, John stood outside the bedroom while Margaret stood inside. Suddenly, the knocks rang out again, this time from the door between them. A few months later, Maggie would tell a lawyer that on the first night they heard the rapping, they all got up, lit candles, and searched the house from top to bottom. The noise continued while they were hunting, always coming from the same place in the bedroom. It wasn't loud, but it was as real as anything she'd ever heard. It shook the beds and chairs, too. In fact, when she held her hands against the bed frame, she said there was a feeling of what she described as tremulous motion. But that was only the beginning. In mid-March, Maggie and Kate said goodbye to their cousin, who went back to her mother Leah in the city, just before things exploded into action. On the night of Friday, March 31st, Margaret said that the family was determined to get a good night's rest, so they decided to go to bed early. She was anxious about the strange noises, but she set her jaw and pulled up the covers. They were all still awake when the noises began. As Margaret later described it, Kate was the first to sit up in bed, and she decided that when the knocks came, she would snap her fingers in response. Come they did, and right on cue, Kate snapped her fingers. Then, and this is what began to really startle Margaret, the rapping sounds replied. Maggie sat up too and said out loud into the air, "Now do as I do. Count 1, 2, 3, 4, clapping along in time. The knocking sounds obeyed her, which left Maggie frozen by fear, and the girls silent. And that's when their mother took over. She asked aloud that if the sound was a spirit, it should knock twice. After a breath, 2 knocks rang out. With the girls silent in the opposite bed, Margaret haltingly asked a series of questions, and each time, the knocks answered her. Through these responses, they learned that the specter had once been a 31-year-old man, and as more and more details followed, I can only imagine the panic that caught in Margaret's throat. He'd been killed just 2 years before, he claimed, right there, in their house. When John stepped into the room, he found his daughters paralyzed by fear and his wife shouting questions to the wall. But he heard it too. Her questions, the knocking sounds answering back, all of it. And the couple knew that whatever they were witnessing, it was beyond them. So John bundled up and set out to fetch the nearest neighbors. When he returned, he and the neighbor found the girls still in bed, still terrified, and still clinging to each other. With more witnesses in the room, Margaret asked the same series of questions, and got the same answers as before. By the end of the night, a total of 4 families had been called to the Foxes' house, including the Hydes and their adult son, David. And before long, they were all communicating with the knocking sound. Through their questions, they sketched out a picture of the man's life and his death. The listeners crowded into the room as the spirit rapped out that he had been a traveling peddler, and that he'd been murdered in that very bedroom, his throat cut with a butcher's knife, before his body was buried beneath the dirt floor of the cellar. The information set the group in motion. They did what so many following waves of spiritualists would do, too. They put the spirit to the test. John, his son David, and the Hydes all went down to the cellar to start digging. But the first weeks of spring of 1848 had been wet. Their shovels sank into the damp cellar floor, and water oozed up, making any attempt at discovery impossible for the moment. With the story of such a gruesome crime hanging in the air, the mood that first night must have been somber. Fear and curiosity, fascination and confusion, a tired and dirty circle of neighbors asking themselves if they'd really been speaking with the spirit. What had they witnessed in the middle of that spring night? It didn't take long for it to become clear that something irresistible had burst forth. Word got out. Less than 2 weeks later, John said that hundreds had already visited the house. Among them was a lawyer who rushed to Hydesville on April 11th and started taking statements from the witnesses. John told him that curious visitors were coming so often that he couldn't even work at the forge, and his family no longer had time to cook, clean, and live their daily lives. Maggie, though, must have loved it. But John was still at a loss regarding the eerie phenomenon. After 2 weeks of deep consternation and scrutiny, he still couldn't make up his mind about the sounds. He desperately wanted to view them as something natural and explainable, which was certainly the more sane path to take. The alternative, though, while a lot less believable, was also more frightening. Something supernatural was at work. Leah Fish hovered over the piano bench. Her students plunked out the basics that she was teaching them. Upright pianos were the centerpiece of every middle-class parlor, and Leah had carved out a living for herself and her daughter by guiding the children of aspiring Rochester families through the foundational elements of music. It was a respectable profession for a single mother, one of only a few that were. On that morning in May, the music lesson was interrupted when a student's mother rushed into the room and pulled Leah aside. She was followed by a man who had just come from a visit to see Leah's parents in Hydesville. With the introduction barely made, he flipped open a fat notebook and started peppering her with questions. But Leah had no idea what the man was talking about. To answer her, he introduced a set of freshly printed pages. It was a pamphlet with the headline, "Mysterious Noises," which reported on the various statements that he had taken in Hydesville. It was the first that Leah had heard of the uncanny visitation. Within a few hours, though, Leah, her daughter, and 2 friends were all on an overnight package delivery boat steaming down the Erie Canal toward Hydesville. Leah found her parents' home abandoned. They had taken up shelter at David's house nearby, and when Leah arrived, she saw a ragged Margaret with a Bible clutched to her chest. The family had been thrown out of the local Methodist Episcopal Church. Word had gone around that little Kate said the spirit's name was Mr. Splitfoot, and the story had shocked the minister. Blasphemy, he had said. Devil worship. The whispers were flying throughout the neighborhood. The blacksmith had brought hammer and tongs to Hydesville, they all said, but he'd also brought something else, too. His 2 daughters and their bond with Satan. The church had accused the family of witchcraft before telling them to leave and not come back. Perhaps there wasn't much distance between Rochester and Salem after all. Leah and her parents put their heads together. They all agreed that the girls should be split up. If the spirit was real, maybe he was attracted to one of the sisters in particular. Guessing that it was Kate, they decided she would be the one to leave the farm. Leah worked quickly, taking her youngest sister back to Rochester with her. Separating the sisters didn't stop the troubles, though. Years later, Leah would publish an account of what happened when they reached the city. The girls, she said, were too scared to sleep alone that night, so Leah brought them both into her bed. Before she could fall asleep, though, their screams of fear broke the silence. With Kate in the bed beside them, her daughter said a cold hand had passed over her face and then another crept down her back. Leah leapt for her Bible and began to read it out loud, but as she would later recall, the girls continued to feel something unseen touch their bodies. When Leah put out the light and slid the Bible under her pillow, something pushed it back out and onto the floor. They had no peace and no sleep until the light of dawn started to filter through the window and the room fell blissfully silent. But other voices would fill that silence. As the Fox family tried to adjust to their new life, that energetic lawyer wasted no time distributing his pamphlet throughout the city. He had the sense that a printed report of the rumors, full of eyewitness interviews that he himself had recorded, would fly off the shelves. And his instincts proved correct. His pamphlet called Report of the Mysterious Noises Heard in the House of John D. Fox in Hydesville poured fuel on the whispers, helping the news spread like wildfire. But when Amy and Isaac Post first heard the rumors about the hauntings in Hydesville, they laughed. In a letter from that November, Isaac would tell a relative that at first he and Amy paid no more heed to the news than to the old Salem witch stories, he said. Leah would write that the Posts had, and I quote, "no little amusement at our expense."